So the beta amyloid protein is cut in the wrong ways by different faulty enzymes, and it causes the peptide or the beta amyloid to then form these plaques. These plaques go outside of the cell into the extracellular space of the brain and are toxic to the brain. Now let's talk about tau protein. This is the other important protein where when it's normally functioning, it's really healthy for the brain. But unfortunately, if things go wrong, it forms these structures called tangles, which are toxic. So tau protein is mainly found in the central nervous system. And what it does is it stabilizes microtubules of axons. If you remember, axons are the long part of the nerve that propagates electrical signal. And so microtubules help to make the structure of the axon, and the tau protein helps these microtubules. If tau is hyperphosphorylated, so too much phosphorus is stuck to it, it makes the protein faulty, and then it self-assembles into this ball or a tangle. Tangles are insoluble, so they accumulate and they can't be broken down, and they build up in the brain, and that's what leads to Alzheimer's disease. This is a brain biopsy of someone after they passed away with pretty severe Alzheimer's, and this is just to point out that this stain here is staining for beta amyloid, and you can see that it's a round plaque of all the protein inside the brain. Here, these dark structures are stained for tau, and they're these funky structures just full of balls or tangles of the tau protein. Again, these cannot be broken down in the brain, and so their buildup is really toxic and leads to all the symptoms of Alzheimer's. So more about genetics. There's one gene called ApoE on chromosome 19, which has been highly associated with just the regular run-of-the-mill Alzheimer's, which is the one that happens after age 65 and affects most of our elderly. But it's not the only gene associated with Alzheimer's, and so we can't just test everyone for ApoE and say that they will or will not get Alzheimer's disease, because it's a little bit more complicated than that. And the environment and other genes also play a role. If someone inherits one bad copy of ApoE, they have a slight higher risk of getting Alzheimer's, but it may be mild. And if you inherit two bad copies of ApoE on chromosome 19, you have a higher chance of having an earlier onset of Alzheimer's and having a more severe form, but it's not 100%. And that's what makes this disease really hard and difficult to test for. This is in contrast to inherited Alzheimer's disease, which is the form that is very rare and in less than 1% of all cases. It's an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance, which means that if it runs rampant in a family, if one parent has Alzheimer's, their kids each have a 50% chance of getting Alzheimer's. Again, it happens much earlier in life and is more severe. And basically, mutations occur that cause the beta amyloid protein to either there's too much of it being made, it aggregates too much, or there's not enough clearance of it, and so it's around more to form those plaques in the brain. There's 3 genes involved in inherited forms of Alzheimer's, including amyloid precursor protein or APP, PSEN1, and PSEN2. I bolded PSEN1 because this gene in particular is really associated with a more severe form of the inherited disease and has been found in patients who have Alzheimer's as early as 40 years of age. But what age you really get this inherited form depends on what age your parents exhibited symptoms. And again, this form is really, really rare. So in general, what does Alzheimer's disease look like? Well, you have memory impairment. And in particular, episodic memory is impaired, which I will talk about on the next slide. But more importantly, executive function and visuospatial impairment is present early on. What I mean by that is that your ability to control your impulses and your ability to know where things are in space, where you are in regards to the neighborhood, driving directions, where things are kept in the grocery store, where things are kept in your house. That all goes pretty quickly and early on in Alzheimer's. Later on, your language and your behavior can be affected, but that happens later on. And this is going to be in contrast to other forms of dementia, which we'll talk about later, where language is affected first. So just remember in Alzheimer's, it's more memory and your executive and visual spatial functioning, which goes bad first. So in Alzheimer's disease, episodic memory is affected. And in particular, there's 3 different types of episodic memory. Immediate recall is something where someone tells you something like a phone number and you repeat it back right away. That's immediate recall, where it's in your mind for about 5 to 10 seconds and you can just say it back. So if I tell you 6572, you say 6572 back right away. If you can imagine, in patient with Alzheimer's, they can't even immediately recall something that you just told them, and that can go awry. Delayed recall is something like, I told you it's my birthday next week, and then when the next week comes, you completely forget. So it's within a few days. And then remote memory is really past events, like when you graduated high school or when you got married. This is the last to go in Alzheimer's, but it can go as well. But most likely immediate recall and delayed recall go first, and they seem to be more of the problem for a long period of time. And only in later stages of Alzheimer's does the remote memory go. This is a picture of someone's brain. This is a healthy brain, and this is someone with Alzheimer's disease. So as you can see here, this is a nice healthy brain where we have the cerebral cortex. These spaces are called the sulci, so there are deep folds in the brain, and these round structures of tissue are called gyri. As you can see, the sulci and gyri look nice and healthy. This part of the brain is called the temporal lobe, and within the temporal lobe there's a structure called the hippocampus. It's often called the jelly roll of the brain because it's this nice, round, swirly part. The hippocampus is really important for episodic memory, which we just talked about on the other slide. And in Alzheimer's disease, the hippocampus gets affected, and this gets shrunken up and eaten, and that's why they have significant memory problems. So if we look over here on this panel, this patient's sulci and gyri are really prominent, meaning that they've had so much brain tissue loss that the folds are so deep and the whole brain is shrunken. And if you look at this part, it looks like it's been eaten away. So the temporal lobe is shrunk, and the hippocampus, which is that jelly roll structure for memory that's really important, is kind of flattened and smushed to the side, and there's big holes in the temporal lobe. Another important feature of Alzheimer's disease is that they often develop neuropsychiatric symptoms in the middle to later part of the disease. They can manifest a lot of irritability. They won't want to hang out with their family or friends anymore and just sit alone. They often have depression, and they sometimes develop psychosis, which means that they hallucinate, they see things that aren't there, they are talking to people, or they hear things, they hear voices, and they have delusions, which means they have fixed ideas about things that are not really real. It often mimics other neuropsychiatric diseases like schizophrenia or bipolar, but it's really not a mental illness in that way, but it's really part of the Alzheimer's dementia itself because the brain is just degenerating. It's really important for any patient with dementia of any form to always ask about to ask about depression and mood symptoms and to see if they're hallucinating, because we have medications that can help control this, and it'll make the patient feel more comfortable. So overall, it's quite depressing that there is not really good treatment to cure Alzheimer's disease whatsoever. We can really only treat symptoms. So if someone's depressed, I can put them on a medication to help control their depression. If they're falling asleep a lot, I can give them a stimulant to make them more awake. But I really don't have any medication in the toolbox to prevent the development of beta amyloid plaques or tangles, tau tangles, and we have no way of improving memory. There's 2 classes of dementia medications, which I'll talk about, and they help a little bit, but they don't really seem to prevent or slow down the progression of Alzheimer's in a significant way. The most important things we can do for patients are non-pharmacologic interventions. So ensuring adequate nutrition and having them eat really healthy helps in general to limit cholesterol and scarring in the brain and to prevent strokes. Because if you can imagine someone has a stroke on top of Alzheimer's, that's much more devastating than just Alzheimer's alone. Making sure that they exercise, because the endorphins that are released are neuroprotective and can help keep what parts of the brain that are working properly healthier for longer. And cognitive rehab programs, which are basically adult daycares where people go and they have classes where they can really work on language or memory, and they're also social with other people. So the two classes of Alzheimer medications that we often put patients on, even though they don't help so much, there's some evidence that they help a little bit, like a few percentage points, and they have really little side effects, so it doesn't hurt to put someone on it just to try. One of these medications are called cholinesterase inhibitors, and there's 3 types listed here. I won't get into too much detail, but basically we find that patients with Alzheimer's have little choline, which is a neurotransmitter, and so cholinesterase is an enzyme that breaks down choline. So if we can inhibit this enzyme, a cholinesterase inhibitor, then the enzyme can't work to break down choline. So there'll be more choline around in the brain. And overall, we know that that is healthy for patients and can help with memory a little bit. Then there's something called an NMDA receptor antagonist. So basically, there's a receptor called NMDA, and there's a neurotransmitter called glutamate. When glutamate binds to NMDA, it causes a lot of excitatory responses in the brain, and sometimes that can be a little too toxic. And so receptor antagonists like memantine just block this receptor so glutamate can't go onto the receptor, and it just protects the neurons from getting excitotoxic effects. So just to remember, Alzheimer's disease is the most prevalent form of dementia. It forms beta amyloid plaques extracellularly. It forms tau tangles intracellularly. The hippocampus, which is part of the temporal lobe, is mainly involved, and it gets very shrunken and eaten up over time. Out of all the cognitive domains, episodic memory and the visuospatial executive cognitive domains are impaired first. All patients usually tend to develop some kind of psychiatric problem, and there's 2 classes of meds, but they're not that helpful. So now we're going to move on to the second type of dementia, which is called vascular dementia. Oftentimes, vascular dementia is caused by strokes. What happens is, if there's not enough blood flow to the brain, such as in strokes, you build up these scars, these white spots all over in the brain. And these white spots are pretty toxic and they don't allow the brain to function normally, and so it can cause dementias. So remember, Alzheimer's is the most common form, and then vascular dementia is the second most common form, and it represents 25% of all dementias. Risk factors include all the things that make you high risk for stroke: diabetes, high blood pressure, having obesity, and smoking. Anything that increases your risk of having a stroke or heart attack will put you at risk for having vascular dementia. A buzzword that I want you to remember is that it has a stepwise cognitive decline, which means that basically a patient will have a stroke, and then right away you can tell that one of their cognitive domains takes a hit. And then as these kind of strokes and the symptoms of strokes build up, you really start to have more and more cognitive decline, and it's really obvious. So you function well, and then all of a sudden, boom, you take a hit, and you decline really quickly. And then you stabilize, and then maybe you don't stop smoking, or your diabetes stays under control, and you have another stroke, boom, and you take another hit, and you fall further down the staircase. That's what we mean by a stepwise cognitive decline. Impairment is mainly in executive functioning, plus whatever got affected by the stroke, like your strength, or if you go numb, or if you have language problems, that tends to be a problem, plus executive functioning. Prognosis, i.e. how well you'll do, will only depend if you take the steps to prevent further strokes from happening. But if you have a stroke, but then you don't take your aspirin or do the medications that your neurologist tells you to, you can keep having more and more strokes, and that builds up over time. So again, patients present with a slow cognitive decline in a stepwise fashion. Sometimes vascular dementia can be silent without an identifiable stroke, but when you take an MRI or CAT scan of the brain, you see the buildup of all those white spots, which means that they had a lot of silent strokes that built up over time and have caused dementia. Silent strokes happen when you have really, really minor symptoms that no one notices, like you just trip up on some words sometimes, and your language is a little off, but people don't notice, so you don't really realize you had a stroke, but you did. Executive functioning is impaired. Memory loss is less of a problem compared to Alzheimer's. Again, just like Alzheimer's though, they have a lot of certain neuropsychiatric symptoms, including depression and psychosis. Psychosis meaning hallucinations and delusions. In addition, there's 3 specific things that can happen in vascular dementia that I want to talk about. The first thing is called abulia, which means the